Yeah.
Jesus was a white man too, but you know, it's like he was a historical figure. I mean, that's a verifiable fact, as is Santa. I just want the kids watching to know that.
Oh, that is a bad picture of me.
Nobody questions.
Now who took this?
Black Jesus is trending worldwide, and some people are absolutely losing it. We are pulling back the curtain on one of the biggest historical cover-ups ever sold to the world. If you're new here, comment where you're watching from, drop a like, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Because this one is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable.
Have you ever wondered why Jesus, a man born in the Middle East thousands of years ago, has been famously portrayed as a white man? Well, I'm about to tell you, but you gotta stick with me. Good evening, Alex Star Nation. I recently saw this clip of Good Omens come up on my For You page where it's portraying Jesus as biblically accurate Jesus. And if we now know this actor is what Jesus would have most likely looked similar to, why have we been portraying Jesus as a white man for the longest time? Now, this phenomenon dates back to where some of the most famous pieces of biblical art come from, and that is the Renaissance era. Think about The Last Supper, Pietà by Michelangelo, any Madonna and Child painting. These are pieces that are highly revered and where we most likely get the idea of Jesus being a white man and portrayed as a white man. During the Renaissance, artists were really preoccupied with making their pieces look like the world around them, so they were using contemporary models, contemporary places in order to model their pieces after so they would look more realistic. Biblical figures like Jesus and Mary were often put in contemporary Italian settings and contemporary Italian clothing, and they looked like contemporary Italian people because who was in Italy during the Renaissance? White people. Now, what they were doing is called anachronism. I'm about to read you the definition. An anachronism is a person, object, or concept placed outside of its appropriate historical time, often causing a clash with the setting's era. But they weren't doing this because they were just unaware of history and they didn't know what Jesus looked like, but it was often intentional. Like I said before, since a lot of artists during the Renaissance were really preoccupied with making their pieces look more real and feel more real, they often modeled the things that were in their pieces on the world around them. And it made the scenes that they were painting more understandable to the average viewer. It also had a religious purpose, because a lot of people back then largely were illiterate. So one of the ways to pass on biblical stories and biblical teachings was through art. So they put Jesus and Mary and the apostles and all these saints and biblical figures in contemporary clothing, in contemporary settings, and made them look like contemporary people so they would be easier to understand and empathize with. So even though realism and making these pieces feel as if they were just a part of the contemporary Italian world was a big motivation for the artists at the time, historical accuracy was not really at the forefront of their minds. Now, the idea of commissioners and artists wanting people to be closely connected to and empathize with Jesus comes from St. Francis of Assisi. Followers of St. Francis were called Franciscans, and the Franciscan ideology heavily emphasized forming a personal, emotional relationship with Jesus. So a lot of the art that was commissioned by the Franciscans or inspired by the Franciscan ideology at this time wanted people to connect with Jesus personally. It's easier to empathize with somebody who looks like you, comes from a similar background, maybe within your community. It's just easier to empathize with people who you can relate to personally. So if Jesus, looks like your brother or your son, it's easier to empathize with him. If Mary looks like your mom, it's easier to empathize with her. So at the end of the day, a lot of these images weren't necessarily about historical accuracy, but they were more focused on getting people trying to better empathize and personally connect to Jesus. And it's not like the Renaissance artists were unaware of the past. They knew what the fuck was going on in the past. They were really obsessed with Greek and Roman art. But the main point is that they weren't trying to recreate historical accuracy. Like, think about a show like Stranger Things. The show is set in the 80s. So the actors, they're dressed like they're from the 80s. Their makeup is done like they're from the 80s. Their hair is from the 80s. The pop culture references, they're from the 80s. The way that the scenes and the backgrounds and the setting is set up is like it's from the 80s. That is something that is fairly modern. That's a fairly modern idea, trying to accurately depict the past when we are in the present. Even now, we're not doing it like 100% accurately. You know, Stranger Things kind of goes all in on the 80s nostalgia in order to give us a more 80s feeling. And that is done on purpose in order to get an emotional reaction out of the viewer. So Jesus wasn't painted white just because like Renaissance artists didn't know Jesus was brown. It says in the Bible that he's brown. They know who's brown. But he was painted that way in order to get people to better understand his suffering, in order to have a more personal and close connection with him. And I still think we do this nowadays. You know, I'm Black. If you're Black, I'm pretty sure you've seen a Black Jesus or two in your lifetime. I just want y'all to remember that whenever we look back at a lot of Renaissance paintings, a lot of them don't really show truth of what was going on back in the day. I could talk more about that later, but I'm just explaining to y'all why Jesus is white.
Jesus wasn't a white European, okay? It's Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus of Newcastle. Do you think the three wise men popped into Waitrose on their way to the manger? Do you think Mary got a cheeky Greggs on her way to the stable? They didn't eat pork either, so I would recommend the vegan sausage roll. And then afterwards she grabbed a meal deal, popped herself on a donkey and trotted up the M6. Do you think Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount in a Brummy accent? Do you think Matthew, Mark, Peter and John were their real names? You don't worship Jesus, you worship race. Someone told me once that the reason why Christian nationalists think that Christianity is for white people is because they've made Jesus appear white, even though he's brown. And that's because they can't fathom the idea of worshipping a man who is brown-skinned. And I think she had a really good point. Jesus is a brown man. His mother wore a headscarf. If he came back today with no paperwork, no passport, I don't think any European country would actually let him in.
Listen, they lied to you because Jesus is not white. Jesus was brown. And you know, growing up, I always wondered that because where the Bible says that Jesus was born, this is why you need to read your Bible. He was born in the Middle East. If you look up the skin color of where Jesus was born in Middle Easterns, they are brown. Beautifully brown, but they are not white. So I don't really know where that came from, and I'm not saying that whoever decided to do that is racist. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that we really need to understand history. And I always wondered why we had little white Jesuses up, like in grandma's houses, at churches, you know, just anywhere. Like you would buy something somewhere that would be a depiction of Jesus, and he was always white. And I'm like, Jesus ain't white. If that hurts your feelings, I'm sorry. Maybe you need to check your heart. But he's brown, as brown as they come.
What a very good question. And I've actually seen this question asked multiple times. So it leads me to the conclusion that there's something that a lot of people actually may not be aware of. In many places and societies across the world, Jesus is actually often depicted as looking like the people from those areas. And here are just a few examples. And the reason for this is actually quite simple. Jesus is often depicted in various different areas of the world as closely resembling the people from those different areas, because it in fact makes Jesus more relatable as a deity to look like the people from those areas. So, as has been shown, Jesus is often not just depicted as white, but is often depicted as resembling various peoples from all across the world.
What color was Jesus? I was asked this today outside of the metro stop. I was administering ashes for Ash Wednesday, and this young black guy walks straight up to me and he says, "What color was Jesus?" And I am so glad that I know the right answer, because in my younger years, I would have said something completely different and completely wrong. And I told him, Jesus was black, and his face lit up, and he said, "I never imagined in my wildest dreams that a white priest would admit that Jesus was black." And here's the thing, Jesus was obviously dark-skinned. That's unquestionable. But he was also ontologically black. He was born into an oppressive empire, and his life was threatened from day one. He knew what it was like to be hunted and to have the illusion of freedom. As James Cone said, the cross of Christ was the lynching tree in America. Jesus was lynched by Rome, just like so many black people in America. I'm not sure why Jesus being black is so threatening to some white Christians, but it is. You'll find out in the comments. So if it's threatening to you, maybe this Lent is an opportunity to go inward and find out why your Jesus needs to be white. Because Jesus was absolutely black. And that truth matters because if we're going to have a relationship with him, we need to recognize him first. I love you, all of you, and I'll see you out there.
I know a guy who said that he can't relate to shows where the lead isn't like a white guy because it's like he wants to be able to see himself as the lead.
Well, that's why they made Jesus white.
Literally.
One of the greatest stories ever told.
You can't relate if he isn't.
They are shoved down their throat how white is our hero.
Yeah.
Not for me.
Not for you.
Why is Jesus white if he was from the Middle East? Across the West, Jesus is depicted as white and European, but he was actually brown and Middle Eastern. And in 1940, one painting made white Jesus permanent. Jesus spent his life in the Middle East, never traveling beyond Judea. People in that region had brown skin, coarse dark hair, and features shaped by the climate. When anthropologists reconstructed his appearance from 1st century skulls, they created a brown-skinned man with a broad nose and dark curly hair. So when did Jesus become white? It started in the 1500s during the Renaissance. European artists began painting Jesus in their own likeness. The goal was to make Christ feel relatable, someone their audience could recognize and connect with. Leonardo da Vinci painted Italian faces at the Last Supper, while artists like Albrecht Dürer went further, creating a self-portrait in 1500 where he posed as Christ. But the image billions recognize today came centuries later. That image came in 1940 from Warner Salmon, an American artist who'd worked in advertising. He painted the head of Christ, blonde hair, blue eyes, soft features. Then he partnered with Christian publishers who mass-produced it everywhere. Prayer cards, calendars, church windows. Within decades, it became the most reproduced religious image in history. A Middle Eastern Jew became a Western icon through art and advertising.
Jesus was white. Okay, Jesus was white, and that's what I'm telling people now. Not because I genuinely believe it, but I think white people really need the win.
So I grew up a Christian, right? And I always thought that Jesus had blonde hair and blue eyes, because that's what the church told me. But I just found out that Jesus was an Arab. What does an Arab look like? They have brown skin, brown eyes, brown hair. So where did the church get this concept of a white man? It's just crazy to me. Even if Jesus is God, right? The second commandment that Moses brought is do not make images of God. The churches I had so many different statues. They had Mother Mary, they had Jesus, they had images, paintings. But this is quite literally breaking the commandments of Moses, which Jesus also says in Matthew chapter 5, is that he came to fulfill the commandments of Moses, not to abolish them. So how does this make any sense?
One thing that I never understood was the whitewashed Jesus thing, because I grew up Greek Orthodox, so my Jesus looked like this. And I thought that this must have been whitewashed Jesus. I'm like, is this not a Middle Eastern man? I thought this was obvious. And then I look at your guys' Jesus and I'm like, oh, who's got them white babies there? What the hell?
I'm gonna say this one time for all the Pan-Africanists, African spiritualists, Kemetic community, Hebrew Israelites, etc., etc., etc. in my comment. Okay, so if you actually read this book in its context from start to finish, you would not arrive at a white Jesus, nor would you arrive at a white Christianity. I'm really tired of this being regurgitated in my comments and in other black Christians' comments because it's just intellectually dishonest. If you read this book, you truly read this book, you would arrive at a Hebrew, brown, Jewish man, Jesus Christ, who was a carpenter, who worked on the very thing he would hang on years later for our sin, died the death we should have died because he lived a life we couldn't live, and we have the opportunity to be resurrected with him. My thing is, I think it's obvious as to why slave masters would not want us to read this book. So saying that Christianity is a function of white supremacy, I think is white supremacy, because they didn't want us reading this. There's a reason that we were illiterate. There's a reason that we didn't know things like there's no Jew or Gentile in Christ Jesus. There's a reason that our ancestors still turned to Jesus when they found out about Jesus. There's a reason that there's a whole book in here called Philemon where Paul writes and says, hey, I'm sending your slave back to you, but receive him as a brother. Like, there's a reason that they did not want us to know the stories that are in this word, because if we knew the stories that were in this word, we would know that our value is intrinsic, that we are image bearers, that Jesus Christ didn't only come to die for white people, but he very clearly came to die for Jews first and for us. So this is just, again, intellectually dishonest. Second thing is, just because something predates something, is older, does not mean that it's necessarily true. Somebody said, oh, you need to go back and look at all the different Kemetic religions. And even if I were to concede the point that there were other African spiritual religions that predated Christianity, even though we know that Christianity was in Ethiopia and large parts of East Africa before places in Europe, even if I were to concede and still man and say, okay, yeah, there were other religions older than Christianity that we practiced until colonialism, just because those religions existed prior to us hearing about Christianity does not mean that those religions are necessarily true. And if you were to read this book, you would see that there's a very similar historical narrative in the Bible where people are worshiping false idols, false religions. God plucks Abraham out of the nations and says, I'm going to create a nation through you, and through your lineage, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is going to incarnate and save all of mankind. So even in the word, there's a time where other religions predate Jesus coming. So that is not proof. Validity is textual criticism. Validity is other historical documents corroborating the stories of the Bible that aren't in the Bible. Validity is the 500 eyewitness accounts that saw Jesus Christ after he resurrected from the dead. People saw him get up. Like, this is what we hang our faith on, because God doesn't necessarily require a blind faith. He left us a paper trail. And so to come in Black Christians' comments and continue to act like we're uneducated, we don't know our word, we don't know our culture, we don't know our history, again, is just dishonest, and it's ingenuine. And the reality of the matter is that if you're promoting this idea that Christianity is white supremacy, you're probably more aligned with slave masters than you actually think you are. So stop, and please come to know Jesus, the real Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth.
Go to many parts of Africa right now and ask any child under 10, perhaps even older, put a picture of a white person in front of them, put a picture of a black person in front of them. Ask them, if God was human, would he be the white person or the black person? 15 times out of 10, they're going to attribute God to being the white person, attribute Satan to being the black person, because this was the intention. Not the only intention, possibly even a byproduct of the actual intention, but this is something that happens as a result of religion, Abrahamic religions. Black people indulging in Abrahamic. And I hate to sound like I'm some crusader for anti-religion. It's just the mere facts. I'm trying to be as like, this is not about my emotions or how I feel about religion. This is just simple psychology. And we've had many instances of this across many different platforms in every part of the diaspora. Do you understand? So what we're talking about are our African parents and that sort of latent colonial mindset that they have sometimes. Religion is one of the biggest tools, if not the biggest tool, in keeping Black people docile and dormant and redundant. I promise you this. So I absolutely love this comment that this person has left here, because it ties into something that I also feel very passionate about.
And that's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. If God is God, if he truly loves every human being equal, then why does the color of his skin make some people so uncomfortable? Black people worshipped a white Jesus for centuries and never rioted, never panicked, never made it a crisis. But the moment the truth starts surfacing, suddenly it's a problem. That tells you everything you need to know. Not about Jesus, about power, about who built this image and why. History doesn't lie. Art doesn't lie. The Bible doesn't lie. People do. And the people who rewrote this story knew exactly what they were doing, because a conquered people who worship the face of their oppressor are easier to control. That's not religion. That's strategy. So wherever you stand on these, Christian, agnostic, spiritual, or just curious, the real question isn't what color Jesus was. The real question is, who benefits from the lie? Think about that. If this episode makes you think, makes you feel something, or make you want to dig deeper, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. We are just getting started. See you in the next one.